Prepare to dive into the depths of antiquity, where myth and reality merge, and every legend holds echoes of eternal wisdom. What awaits us is not merely a story, but a journey through the ages, tracing tales whispered for centuries under starry skies, passed from mouth to mouth like a gentle echo in majestic halls. Let the world around us pause for a moment, and everyday worries dissipate, giving way to the magic of ancient lore. Focus your attention, for we are embarking on a journey to a land where gods walked among mortals, and every narrative held a kernel of truth, veiled in wonder. In the picturesque foothills of ancient Sicily, where boundless meadows were strewn with wild flowers, like a vibrant tapestry woven by an unseen artist, young Persephone spent her days in pursuits that might seem surprisingly ordinary for a divine being. Her primary occupation was gathering flowers, but not in haste, as one might pluck a common dandelion. No, Persephone glided through these meadows like a gentle breeze, her bare feet barely disturbing the morning dew, every movement imbued with grace. She knelt beside fragrant clusters of narcissus, their snow-white petals catching the first rays of the rising sun, and with extraordinary care selected only the most perfect specimens. Her woven basket gradually filled with delicate hyacinths, fragrant roses and velvety violets, which seemed to exude an inner glow. One could almost feel the sweet, intoxicating scent lingering in the air, a blend of honey and freshly cut grass, the fragrance of a spring morning when everything feels new and full of boundless possibilities. Persephone's mother, the mighty Demeter, was the revered goddess of the harvest, and together they brought abundance and bloom to the world. Their lives unfolded in harmony, peaceful and predictable, like the inexorable changing of seasons bringing comfort, reliability and security. However, on that fateful morning, as Persephone wandered further from her usual paths, something unusual caught her eye. A single narcissus flower, strikingly larger and incomparably more beautiful than any she had ever seen, grew in a secluded glade. Its petals shimmered like pearls, and its unearthly fragrance lured her forward with an irresistible force, as if someone had called her name. What Persephone did not know, and could not have known, was that this flower had not been placed there by chance. It had been grown from a seed planted deep beneath the earth, in caves so vast and hidden that sunlight never touched their walls. In this gloomy realm where eternal night reigned, ruled Hades, the lord of the underworld. He was not the malevolent tyrant he is sometimes depicted as in certain legends. He was simply lonely. Imagine infinity in a place where nothing grew, nothing changed, nothing lived. The silence there would be deafening, wouldn't it? Hades had observed Persephone during his rare visits to the upper world, seen her tend to her flowers with such tender care, and something in his ancient, immortal heart had stirred. But how could the Lord of the Dead court the daughter of the harvest? How could the chasm between life and death, between the brilliance of sunlight and the deep shadow, be bridged? As Persephone bent down to pluck this magnificent, alluring narcissus, the earth beneath her feet trembled. At first it was just a low rumble, like distant thunder or the sound of a passing chariot. But then the ground split open with a roar, like the creak of a huge ancient door on rusty hinges, and from the abyss rose a chariot drawn by 4 black horses whose eyes gleamed like stars in utter darkness. Hades himself, cloaked in a dark mantle that billowed behind him, held the reins. With one swift movement he lifted Persephone into his chariot, and before she could even cry out, they were plummeting back through the gaping earth. The opening sealed behind them as if it had never existed. The only trace left of this sudden disappearance were Persephone's scattered flowers and her overturned woven basket, lying forlornly on the grass. When Demeter discovered her daughter was gone, her grief was immeasurable, surpassing all understanding. Sometimes when a person is overcome with deep sorrow, they just don't want to do anything, do they? No desire to eat, clean, or care for things that are usually important. This is what happened to Demeter, but on such a colossal scale that it affected the entire earth. She stopped caring for the crops. She stopped sending rain. She stopped encouraging seeds to sprout in spring. The world began to sink into cold and barrenness. Leaves yellowed and fell from trees, but no new ones appeared. The grass withered. The flowers died. Even the olive trees, sacred to the gods, began to drop their fruit before it could ripen, foreshadowing a coming catastrophe. Meanwhile, deep in the underworld, something entirely unexpected was happening. Persephone, recovering from her initial shock and fear, began to notice things in her new abode that surprised her. The walls of Hades' palace were inlaid with precious gems that caught and reflected the meager light, reminding her of stars. Subterranean rivers flowed with their own mysterious music, and in gardens where the soil was rich with minerals from the earth's core, grew strange, unusually beautiful flowers, unseen on the surface. Hades himself proved not to be the monster she had expected. He spoke softly, almost shyly. He brought her food she had never tasted before, fruits that grew only in the depths of the earth, sweet and extraordinary. He showed her the asphodel meadows, where the souls of ordinary dead wandered in peaceful dreams. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything of her, but simply hoped she could understand why he had brought her there. However, Persephone longed for the sun. She missed her mother. She missed the feel of warm earth beneath her bare feet and the birdsong in the mornings. No matter how beautiful the underworld was, it was not her home. On the surface, the situation was becoming desperate. Without Demeter's care, people began to starve. The other gods pleaded with her to restore the earth's fertility, but she was unyielding. "Return my daughter to me," she declared, "and the world will bloom again, but not before." Zeus, the mighty king of the gods, finally had to intervene. He sent Hermes, the swift-footed messenger god, to the underworld to negotiate. Hermes found Hades sitting quietly in his garden with Persephone, neither of them speaking, just existing in that strange, timeless state people find themselves in when trying to sort out something complicated and momentous. "She must return," Hermes gently told Hades. "The world above is dying." Hades slowly nodded. He knew this moment would come, but then looked at Persephone with eyes that held all the sadness of the earth's depths. "I understand," he said, "but ask her, has she eaten anything while she was here?" This was a question of paramount importance, for there was an ancient and unbreakable law. Anyone who tasted food in the underworld would forever be bound to it. Persephone looked at her hands. That morning, while walking in Hades' garden, she had seen a pomegranate tree laden with fruit. The pomegranates were unlike any she had ever seen, dark red like precious jewels, each seed gleaming like a tiny ruby. Almost without thinking, she had plucked one and eaten 7 of its seeds. They tasted of concentrated sweetness, like the quintessential essence of all fruits ever grown. 7 seeds, such a small thing to change the fate of the world. Because of these 7 seeds, Persephone could not return to the upper world forever. But Hermes, who was skilled in words and negotiations, reached a compromise worthy of his cunning. For a portion of each year, 1 month for each seed she had eaten, Persephone would remain with Hades in the underworld. For the remaining months, she would return to her mother and the world of sunlight and growing things. So it was decided. When Persephone returned to the surface, Demeter's joy was so great that flowers instantly bloomed wherever her daughter's feet touched the ground. Spring blossomed like laughter, followed by summer with its abundance of growth and warmth. But when it was time for Persephone to return to the underworld, Demeter's grief brought autumn as leaves changed colour and fell, and winter as the world rested under blankets of snow. It is said that in the underworld, Persephone became a queen in her own right. She learned to help Hades judge the souls of the dead fairly. She tended the subterranean gardens which bloomed with flowers unseen by any living human. And gradually she grew fond of this quiet, brooding god who had so dramatically disrupted her life, but treated her with such gentle respect. When spring returned each year, Persephone emerged from the earth like the flowers themselves, bringing with her the memory of depths and darkness that made the sunlight even more precious. And Demeter welcomed her daughter home with such joy that the whole world celebrated with blooming trees, singing birds, and the sweet scent of new grass. Even now, thousands of years later, one can still observe this ancient drama playing out in the changing of the seasons. Every autumn, as the leaves begin to turn, Persephone prepares to return to her underground realm. Every winter, the bare branch and dormant seed wait, like Demeter, for spring's return. And when the first crocus pushes through the snow, it is as if Persephone herself is coming home, heralding rebirth. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other old stories might be hidden in the everyday rhythms of the world around us? What stories do the seasons themselves tell, if only we listen to their silent language? Continuing our discussion of stories hidden in the most mundane things, have you ever wondered where the phrase Achilles' heel comes from? This idiom, firmly embedded in our language, is used to describe a single, seemingly insignificant weakness in a person of outstanding strength or talent. The story behind these words originates from a deep maternal love and a desperate attempt to protect a child from a fate she could not even imagine. Thetis was a sea goddess, a being of ethereal beauty and profound wisdom, whose hair flowed like the boundless ocean waves, and whose eyes reflected the mysterious depths of underwater caves. Having married the mortal king Peleus and borne him a son, she guarded this child with all the fierce, instinctive protectiveness that mothers have felt throughout the ages. However, being a goddess, Thetis possessed the gift of foresight, and what she saw in the future filled her with unspeakable dread. Her son, Achilles, was destined to become the greatest warrior who ever walked the earth. He would be swift as the wind, strong as an untamed storm, and skilled with sword and spear like no mortal. Poets would sing of his exploits for millennia, but he was fated to die young, struck down in battle, still in the prime of his youth. Imagine Thetis cradling her tiny son, feeling his small fingers grip hers, watching him sleep with the perfect serenity of infants. How could she accept that this precious child was destined for such a short, brutal life? She couldn't. She had to try to change his inexorable fate. And so one night, when the entire palace was asleep, and even the usually restless owls were silent, Thetis carefully wrapped her infant in soft blankets and carried him to the banks of the river Styx. This was no ordinary river. It served as the boundary between the world of the living and the grim realm of the dead, and its waters possessed a unique, powerful strength. Anyone who bathed in the river Styx became invulnerable, protected from all harm. The river was black as a moonless midnight, and surprisingly warm. It flowed silently, like a stream of liquid quiet. Thetis waited until the water reached her waist, and then, holding her breath and whispering prayers to any gods who might be listening, she dipped her son into the magical waters. But here was the catch: when holding a baby, you have to hold them tightly so they don't slip. Thetis held Achilles by his heel, her fingers securely gripping his tiny ankle. The waters of the Styx covered every part of the child's body, except for that one small spot where his mother's hand shielded him from the river's touch. When she lifted him, infant Achilles was no longer entirely mortal. His skin had become like armor, capable of deflecting any weapon. No sword could cut him, no arrow could pierce him, no spear could wound him. Thetis had succeeded in protecting her son, or so she thought. Achilles grew up exactly as the prophecies foretold. He was tall and strong, with golden hair that caught the sunlight like ripe wheat fields in summer. He could run faster than the swiftest horses, fight longer than any other warrior, and his mastery of weapons was like a deadly poetry. As he moved across the battlefield, enemies fled before him like autumn leaves before a hurricane. But he was something else too. He was kind to those weaker than him, fiercely loyal to his friends, and surprisingly gentle for such a fierce fighter. He played the lyre beautifully, composing songs about heroes of the past. He cared deeply for his comrades and wept openly when any of them were wounded or killed. In another world he might have been remembered as much for his compassion as for his valor in battle. When the Trojan War began, a conflict that was to last 10 long years, all the greatest warriors of Greece sailed across the wine-dark sea to fight. Achilles went with them, leading his own band of warriors called the Myrmidons. They were devoted to him not only because he was invincible in battle, but because he treated them with respect and shared their hardships. For 9 years Achilles was exactly what one would expect of an invulnerable warrior. He fought in battle after battle, always emerging unscathed, while enemies fell around him like wheat before a scythe. His reputation grew until the mere mention of his name was enough to make enemy armies falter. But then something happened that revealed another side of Achilles, the part of him that felt deeply. His closest friend, Patroclus, was killed in battle by Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy. Patroclus was more than a friend. He was like a brother to him, one who understood Achilles' heart beneath all that invulnerable skin. Achilles' grief was like a force of nature. He wept so loudly that his mother heard him from her palace beneath the sea. He refused to eat or sleep. He cut off his beautiful golden hair and threw it on Patroclus's funeral pyre. And then, driven by a rage that was really love turned inside out, he hunted down Hector and challenged him to single combat. The battle between Achilles and Hector was like watching a storm battle a mountain. Both were incomparably skilled. Both were undeniably brave. but only one was protected by the waters of the Styx. Hector fought bravely, but in the end Achilles' spear found its mark, and Troy's greatest defender fell. What Achilles did next showed both his human heart and his terrible grief. Instead of treating Hector's body with the respect due a worthy enemy, he tied it to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy. It was an act of desecration that shocked both armies and angered the gods themselves. For several days Achilles continued this grim ritual, driving his chariot around the walls of Troy, while Hector's family watched in horror from the city's ramparts. It seemed that by punishing Hector's body, he could somehow punish death itself for taking his friend. But eventually, Hector's father, old King Priam, did something that required more courage than any battlefield charge. He came alone to Achilles' tent in the middle of the night, unarmed and unguarded, to beg for his son's body. The old man knelt before the warrior who had killed his child, and spoke not as a king to an enemy, but as a father to another man who understood loss. "I have done what no mortal has done," Priam said softly. "I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Something in those words pierced Achilles' rage and grief, touching his heart. He looked at this elderly man, bent with sorrow, and saw his own father, who would one day grieve for him in the same way. He wept then, not tears of angry fury, but the cleansing tears of shared human pain. He returned Hector's body to Priam and declared a truce so that Troy could properly mourn its hero. It was one of Achilles' finest moments, showing that even the greatest warrior was, in the end, just a man who could be moved by compassion. But the war continued, and fate had not forgotten its claim on Achilles. In the final battles outside the walls of Troy, as he fought with his accustomed skill and fearlessness, an arrow flew towards him. It was shot by Paris, Hector's brother, who was known more for his beauty than his bravery. Normally, such an arrow would harmlessly bounce off Achilles' protected skin, but this arrow, guided by the god Apollo, found the only vulnerable spot on Achilles' entire body, his heel, the place where his mother's fingers had shielded him from the waters of the Styx. It was such a small target, such an improbable wound, but it was enough. The greatest warrior who ever lived fell because of his heel, the one place where his mother's protective touch had left him mortal. In trying to save her son from his destiny, Thetis had inadvertently created the very weakness that would destroy him. As Achilles lay dying, he thought not of his many victories or his eternal glory, but of simple things, of the feel of sunlight on his face, the sound of his friend Patroclus laughing, the songs he would never finish composing. He thought of his mother and hoped she would understand that he had tried to live a life that honored the life she had given him, even if he could not prolong it as long as she wished. The story of Achilles reminds us that our greatest strengths and our deepest weaknesses often come from the same source, the love of those who care for us. Every protection has its limits. Every gift has its price. And sometimes what makes us strong also makes us vulnerable. Even now, when we speak of someone's Achilles heel, we recall this ancient truth that everyone, no matter how mighty they seem, has that one small place where the arrows of fate can touch them. Perhaps it is not a weakness, but simply part of what makes us human. The arrows of fate that struck Achilles were not the only ones that changed history forever. Sometimes love itself can be the most dangerous arrow of all, as a young musician named Orpheus discovered on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Orpheus possessed a gift beyond ordinary talent. When he played his lyre and sang, flowers bloomed out of season. Rivers changed their course to flow closer to his music. Wild animals sat together peacefully, lions beside lambs, hawks beside mice. All listened with the same dreamy contentment you might feel when someone hums your favorite lullaby. Even trees uprooted themselves and moved closer to hear him play. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing ancient oaks, shuffling like huge, gentle giants, their leaves rustling to the rhythm of a distant melody. Such was the power of Orpheus's music. It made the impossible natural, the magical mundane. The moment Orpheus gave his heart to Eurydice, a forest nymph whose eyes resembled the purest spring waters, and whose laughter was like the melodic whisper of the wind, his musical artistry seemed to reach unprecedented heights. Inspired by this profound feeling, he created enchanting melodies, skillfully capturing the play of sunlight in her dark curls. The rhythms of his songs echoed her graceful movements through green meadows, and the harmonies expressed the immense admiration he felt, simply watching her as she tenderly cared for injured birds or gathered wild honey in the forest thickets. Their wedding day was the epitome of perfection, one of those rare moments that instill unwavering faith in the inherent goodness of the universe. The ceremony took place in a secluded grove where wildflowers arranged themselves in natural circles as if the earth itself had joined the celebration. Orpheus, performing a song specially composed for this momentous occasion, filled the air with magical sounds, and as his voice soared and fell, butterflies resembling living, fluttering confetti circled the loving couple. At the conclusion of the ceremony, as the sun gradually set and the festivities gave way to the serene weariness that inevitably follows a perfectly lived day, Eurydice decided to take a stroll through the meadow. She wished to spend a few moments alone, to fully absorb her boundless happiness, to let it deeply root itself in her heart, much like honey permeates warm bread. Barefoot, through the soft grass, still adorned with her wedding wreath of wild roses, she stepped on something that suddenly stirred beneath her foot. It was a snake, disturbed from its evening rest, which plunged its fangs, bearing deadly venom, into her ankle. Eurydice had time only to utter Orpheus's name before she fell lifeless among the flowers that had just moments before witnessed her jubilation. By the time Orpheus, rushing to her call, reached her, she had already left the world of the living. Her hand remained warm in his, and her face retained a peaceful expression, yet everything that made her Eurydice, her infectious laughter, her gentle jokes, her habit of quietly humming along to his music, all had dissipated like morning mist, irrevocably gone. For 7 days and 7 nights, Orpheus remained beside Eurydice's lifeless body, pouring out his grief in songs so poignant that even the stones seemed to weep. His music had always possessed extraordinary power over the natural world, but now it expressed a pain so unadulterated and profound that it seemed to tear holes in the very fabric of creation. Other mourners tried to persuade him to eat, to sleep, to briefly distract himself from his sorrow and care for himself, but Orpheus was incapable. How could he eat when the person who gave meaning and flavor to his entire life was irrevocably gone? How could he sleep when his dreams were filled with music he could never share with anyone again? At last, a thought, so desperate and fraught with deadly peril, entered his tormented mind that only a man driven to madness by unbearable grief would dare attempt it. He decided to descend into the realm of the dead itself, into the underworld, to persuade Hades to return Eurydice to him. No mortal who had stepped into the abode of the deceased had ever returned. However, Orpheus possessed his unearthly musical gift, and music, he believed, had always been capable of performing even the most unimaginable miracles. The gates to the underworld were hidden in a cave of such incredible depth that the sun's rays never reached its hidden corners. As Orpheus descended deeper, drawing melodies from his lyre to light his way, the familiar sounds of the realm of the dead gradually faded. The agonizing moans of the damned, the ceaseless rush of the river Styx, the creak of the colossal gates, all fell silent, captivated by his song. Even Cerberus, the formidable three-headed dog, tirelessly guarding the entrance to the abode of the dead, lay down and whimpered softly, listening to Orpheus's playing. The monster's 3 pairs of eyes, which usually burned with unquenchable vigilance, closed like the eyelids of a sleepy puppy. Standing before the majestic thrones of Hades and Persephone, Orpheus performed the most significant song of his life. He sang of love that could overcome death itself, of the unbearable pain of separation, of a world that had lost its harmony since Eurydice was taken from him. His melody was so beautiful, so filled with sincere grief and boundless love, that for the first time in all eternity, Hades shed tears. Even the Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance whose hearts seemed harder than stone, found their cheeks wet with tears they perhaps did not remember shedding. Persephone, understanding better than anyone what it meant to be torn from the world of the living, leaned over and whispered something softly to her husband. Hades slowly nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, like any mortal overwhelmed by deep emotion. "Your music has deeply touched our hearts," Hades said, and in his voice was an unexpected, gentle compassion. "We will return Eurydice to you. However, there is one indispensable condition. You must leave the underworld, walking ahead of her, and under no circumstances may you look back until both of you are under the sunlight of the upper world. If you turn to look at her even once before that moment, she will be lost to you forever." This condition seemed entirely feasible to Orpheus. He had already managed to find his way into the underworld. Surely he could find his way back. He nodded eagerly, already anticipating the moment when he and Eurydice would emerge into daylight and begin their life together anew. The journey back began with a feeling of boundless joy. Behind him, Orpheus clearly distinguished Eurydice's familiar footsteps, the faint sound of her breath, the soft rustle of her wedding garment against the stone. At times she quietly hummed the melodies he played, lighting their way, and that sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. However, as they ascended higher, and the path grew steeper and more winding, disturbing doubts began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him seemed so faint, almost imperceptible. What if he was only imagining them? What if Hades had treacherously deceived him, and he was ascending alone, while Eurydice remained forever trapped below? What if she was struggling to keep up, growing tired, falling behind? The closer they got to the surface, the more these fears consumed his mind. He slowed his pace, listening intently for the slightest sign of her presence. Once, when the path was particularly difficult, he heard her stumble slightly, and he had to grip his lyre so tightly to keep himself from turning to help her. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours of climbing, Orpheus discerned something that made his heart flutter with joy. Ahead, a thin strip of sunlight shimmered, marking the exit from the cave. They were almost free. Only a few steps separated them from returning to the world of the living. But as he approached this ray of light, the doubts relentlessly plaguing him reached their peak. The footsteps behind him became so elusive that he could barely hear them. What if Eurydice was still trapped in the shadowy realm behind them? What if she needed his help to overcome this last, crucial threshold? At the very moment his own feet stepped onto the sunlit earth, just one step away from Eurydice's complete salvation, Orpheus turned around. For one perfect, piercing instant he saw her. She stood there, as beautiful as ever, reaching for the light and for him. However, she was still one step inside the boundary of the underworld. And by looking back, Orpheus irrevocably broke the condition of her release. "Farewell, my love," Eurydice whispered, her voice filled with deep sadness, but devoid of anger. She understood that he had turned back because of his love for her, not because of doubt. But this understanding could not change the irreversible consequences. She vanished like morning mist, and this time there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. She simply dissolved, returning to the realm of the dead, and the path behind Orpheus sealed itself, like water closing over a dropped stone. For the remainder of his life, Orpheus dedicated himself to composing songs of love and loss, of that terrible space that lies between hope and despair. His music became even more beautiful than before, but at the same time it was immeasurably sadder, carrying with it a deep realization that some mistakes cannot be undone, and some chances cannot be repeated. He never again attempted to return to the underworld. Perhaps he realized that Hades' mercy could not be sought twice, or perhaps he understood that some sorrows simply need to be carried, allowing them to transform into something else through the alchemy of time and acceptance. The narrative of Orpheus and Eurydice serves as a reminder that love sometimes demands us to perform truly impossible acts, to move forward without looking back, to trust what is unseen, to believe in promises that seem too beautiful to be true. And sometimes, even when we fail in these impossible tasks, the attempt itself becomes a kind of melody that continues to echo throughout the world, long after we are gone. Sometimes, echoes of ancient tales reach us in the most striking ways. Just as Orpheus's music lived on after his disappearance, so too do whispers reach us of a magnificent city that is believed to have sunk into the sea long before the advent of written history. The eminent philosopher Plato was the first to tell the world of the legendary Atlantis in his treatises, describing it as a civilization that existed 9,000 years before his own era. Whether this story was historical fact or served as a kind of philosophical thought experiment about the rise and fall of civilizations, we may never be able to determine with certainty. However, the account he presented was so vivid and detailed that humanity has tirelessly searched for Atlantis ever since. According to Plato's narrative, Atlantis was located on a vast island lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, an area we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This island surpassed Libya and Asia combined in size. Its unique structure consisted of a series of concentric circles, where rings of land alternated with water barriers, resembling a target composed of earth and sea. At the very heart of these circles rose a city of unparalleled beauty, surpassing all imaginable conceptions. Buildings were constructed from black, white, and red stone, quarried directly on the island, and many were skillfully adorned with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal known as orichalcum, which emitted a warm golden glow. At the heart of the great city stood a palace, a true marvel of engineering and artistic skill. Its majestic walls were entirely faced with shimmering silver, and its pointed spires soared skyward, gleaming with pure gold. Within this architectural splendor was a sacred temple dedicated to Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea who, according to ancient tradition, was the progenitor of Atlantis's first king. The temple's exterior was entirely covered in silver, save for its sky-reaching spires, which sparkled with golden brilliance. The interior of the sanctuary was adorned with a colossal statue of Poseidon, depicting the Lord of the Seas driving 6 swift-winged horses, his head reaching the very top of the vast hall, leaving an indelible impression on all who entered. However, perhaps even more striking than the dazzling beauty of the city itself was its unparalleled level of sophistication and development. The inhabitants of Atlantis created an elaborate system of hot and cold springs that continuously supplied water to their luxurious bath complexes, demonstrating advanced engineering solutions. They built extensive harbors capable of receiving ships arriving from the most distant corners of the then-known world, testifying to their broad trade and cultural connections. Moreover, agriculture on the island reached such unprecedented heights that the lands of Atlantis yielded 2 abundant harvests a year. The people of Atlantis, being direct descendants of Poseidon himself, retained echoes of divine essence for many generations. They were known for their profound wisdom, unwavering justice, and astonishing moderation in their desires. Their priorities clearly leaned towards virtue over material wealth and wisdom over the pursuit of limitless power. The laws of their state were carved on majestic pillars of rare orichalcum, and the kings of Atlantis regularly convened alternately every 5 and 6 years to discuss crucial state affairs and ensure the strict triumph of justice throughout their vast realm. For many centuries, countless generations, Atlantis prospered and developed under this wise and just system of governance. Their powerful ships traversed the oceans, reaching the most distant lands, bringing new knowledge and valuable goods to their homeland, and generously sharing their own inventions and innovations that were ahead of their time. The Atlanteans possessed deep knowledge in fields of science that were completely unknown to other civilizations of that period. They understood the laws of celestial motion, unraveled the mysterious properties of various metals, and mastered the art of cultivating vegetation capable of growing in conditions that would seem utterly inconceivable and hostile to life to other peoples. However, with the passage of time, disturbing changes gradually began to occur within the very essence of the Atlanteans. The original divine spark, their heritage from the mighty Poseidon, steadily diminished with each new generation. It was weakened by intermarriage with mortals, and perhaps by the detrimental influence of excessive comfort and boundless prosperity, which had once been their blessing. Where they once found satisfaction in modest means, their hearts now began to crave exorbitant excesses. If before they highly valued wisdom and enlightenment, they now began to prefer cunning treachery, and where they had previously shown generosity to foreigners and their neighbors, they gradually transformed into greedy and aggressive possessors, obsessed with territorial claims. This transformation was slow, almost imperceptible, like the gradual setting of the sun, whose changes in light only become apparent when the entire surrounding light shifts dramatically. The Atlanteans began to look beyond their abundant island, and in this new gaze they no longer saw potential allies and trading partners, but only territories to be conquered and peoples destined for subjugation. They mobilized colossal military power and set out to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. Thanks to their advanced technology and refined, coordinated tactics, the Atlanteans proved virtually unstoppable. One after another, ancient cities and mighty kingdoms fell before their irresistible onslaught, like houses of cards. However, when their invincible legions reached Athens, a city destined to become the cradle of philosophy and home to the great Plato, they encountered fierce and utterly unexpected resistance. The ancient Athenians, despite being vastly outnumbered and technologically outmatched, fought with the desperate resolve of those defending their homes and the righteous indignation characteristic of people who refused to bow to tyranny. Against all predictions and expectations, Athens not only successfully repelled the Atlantean invasion, but launched a decisive counterattack that drove the potential conquerors far back across the seas. It seemed that the courage and virtue that the Atlanteans had lost in their pursuit of power had somehow sprouted and taken root in the fertile Athenian soil. However, the true retribution against Atlantis came not from mortal adversaries, but from the almighty gods themselves. The supreme god Zeus, gazing from his throne on Mount Olympus, perceived what the once noble Atlanteans had become: greedy, aggressive, and thoroughly corrupt beings. He made the final decision that such a civilization had lost all right to continued existence. The end came suddenly, within one day and one night. Terrifying earthquakes shook the island with such furious force that majestic buildings crumbled like fragile sand castles. Powerful volcanic eruptions filled the heavens with thick ash and fire. But the most devastating blow was that the sea itself surged and swallowed the entire landmass. The concentric circles, once the pride and glory of Atlantis, transformed into gigantic whirlpools, mercilessly dragging ships, buildings, and people into their abysses. The magnificent palace, the sacred temple of Poseidon, the vast libraries storing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and the harbours, once welcoming to ships from all corners of the world, all vanished without a trace beneath the relentless waves that closed over the island like a shutting book of history. When morning came, nothing remained of the once thriving island but a boundless, empty ocean. The sea in that region became completely unnavigable, as it was choked with thick mud and silt stirred up from the ocean floor by the catastrophe. Ships that dared to venture into these treacherous waters became hopelessly mired in what resembled liquid, viscous earth, and sailors for generations reported that the area remained utterly impassable. This story could well have fallen into oblivion, like many other tales of divine wrath and human hubris. Yet something about the legend of Atlantis captivated the human imagination with a force that even the most reliable historical chronicles of ruined cities could not match. Perhaps it was the astonishing idea that such an advanced civilization could simply vanish overnight, leaving behind only a myth. Or perhaps it was the tempting prospect that somewhere in the ocean depths, the ruins of this magnificent city still lie, patiently awaiting discovery, beckoning explorers and dreamers. For centuries, tireless explorers, adventurous treasure hunters, and romantic dreamers have diligently searched for traces of Atlantis in various parts of the globe, from the Mediterranean to the vast expanses of the Atlantic, from the Caribbean Sea to the icy shores of Antarctica. Some claim to have found convincing evidence of its existence in mysterious underwater formations off the coast of Bimini. Others suggested that Atlantis is actually a kind of distorted memory of Minoan Crete, which was destroyed by a powerful volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami. However, perhaps the essence lies not in the exact geographical location. Perhaps Atlantis exists not as a physical place that can be discovered with ships and diving equipment, but as a powerful idea that resurfaces again and again in the collective human consciousness. It is the idea of a perfect society that, having reached its peak, destroyed itself by its own success. It is the image of a civilization that ascended to unprecedented heights, but forgot the fundamental values that originally led it to greatness. Every time a society becomes overly proud, excessively overconfident in its perceived superiority, too inclined to impose its will on other nations by force of arms, the ghost of Atlantis silently whispers a warning. Every time we observe technological progress and material prosperity, devoid of wisdom and restraint, we see the very conditions that, in all likelihood, caused the demise of the most advanced civilization the world has ever known. Perhaps this is why people continue to search for Atlantis, not only in the bottomless depths of the ocean, but also in the continuous rises and falls of civilizations throughout human history. We continue to search for it because, in essence, we are constantly recreating its image in our aspirations. And we constantly need to be reminded that the true price of greatness is humility, the ability to remember our origins and the initial meaning of our path. The search for lost greatness often requires far more courage than wisdom. This is what a young prince named Jason discovered when he embarked on a perilous undertaking to retrieve a treasure that seemed utterly unattainable. His daring quest led him to the very edge of the known world, and he made this journey accompanied by a host of great heroes whose names still echo in the sacred halls of ancient legends. Jason's story, like many ancient tales, began with cunning family betrayal. His uncle Peleus treacherously seized the throne that rightfully belonged to Jason's father. When Jason came of age, he returned to claim his lawful inheritance. However, Peleus, being a cunning and ruthless ruler, made Jason an offer that at first seemed generous, but was cleverly designed to get rid of him forever. "I will gladly give you the throne," Peleus said with a feigned smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "But first you must prove your true valor by accomplishing a great deed. Bring me the golden fleece from Colchis, and the kingdom will be yours." The golden fleece belonged to a mythical ram that once saved 2 children, carrying them on its back through the air, lightly and effortlessly like a bird. After the ram was sacrificed to the gods, its fleece, shining like the sun itself, was hung deep in a sacred grove located in the distant kingdom of Colchis, at the eastern end of the Black Sea. However, this treasure did not simply rest there, waiting to be plucked like fruit from a tree. It was under the tireless guard of a dragon that never slept, never closed its vigilant eyes, and never for a moment relaxed its deadly watchfulness. This was not the dragon usually depicted in fairy tales, huge, fire-breathing, and terrifying in its dramatic menace. This guardian was far more fearsome, for it possessed incredible patience keen intelligence, and absolute, unwavering devotion to its duty. The mighty dragon coiled its rings around the ancient oak on which the fleece hung, and its scales constantly changed hue depending on the play of light, sometimes gleaming gold, like the fleece itself, and sometimes turning dark, blending with the shadows among the leaves. Its eyes, like polished amber, tirelessly watched every movement in the grove with the focused intensity of a predator that had all the time in the world. To reach Colchis, Jason needed not just a ship, but a crew brave enough to venture into unknown waters, teeming with monsters, inhabited by hostile tribes, and fraught with navigational hazards that had claimed countless vessels before them. So he ordered the construction of a magnificent ship named the Argo, and issued a call to heroes to join him on an endeavor that everyone understood would likely be a one-way journey. The response to this call was truly astonishing. Heroes from all corners of Greece flocked to join those who would soon be known as the Argonauts. Among them was Heracles, the strongest of all mortals, capable of single-handedly fighting lions and diverting rivers. There was also Orpheus, whose wondrous music could charm even wild beasts and make stones weep. The inseparable twins Castor and Pollux, unsurpassed masters of horsemanship and boxing, also joined the crew, and of course, Atalanta, the renowned huntress, capable of outrunning any man and whose arrows never missed their mark. Each of the valiant heroes gathered for the grand task had their own, sometimes deeply personal reasons for participating. Some sought immortal glory, yearning for their names to be immortalized in tales. Others found allure in the very essence of danger and the unknown, seeking the thrill of adventure. A considerable number of fortune-seekers fled burdensome circumstances or the hardships of home, while others rushed towards vague, not yet fully realized dreams. However, despite the diversity of their driving forces, all were united by one undeniable premonition. The upcoming expedition would be an unprecedented test for each, surpassing anything they had experienced before. The sea voyage to distant Colchis stretched for many months, and each stage presented a distinct, often perilous adventure. The brave seafarers had to pass the legendary Scylla and Charybdis, colossal rock formations that converged and diverged with frightening regularity, mercilessly crushing any vessel that dared to enter their deadly embrace. Later they encountered the Harpies, repulsive creatures with bird bodies and female faces, who relentlessly tormented a venerable elder, a wise king, constantly stealing his provision. The party landed on secluded islands where the locals had never before met foreigners, which required the heroes not only to demonstrate strength, but also to skillfully employ diplomatic skills to continue their journey. The natives sometimes met them with undisguised hostility, sometimes offered invaluable assistance, but invariably showed lively curiosity towards these extraordinary wanderers who had left their native shores so far behind for such a risky mission. When the legendary ship Argo finally reached the shores of Colchis, King Aetes greeted Jason and his valiant crew with that peculiar, subtly treacherous courtesy that powerful rulers usually display towards guests who could prove to be either invaluable allies or deadly threats. The king agreed to yield the coveted golden fleece to Jason, but only on the condition that he successfully completed a series of tasks that seemed utterly impossible. First, Jason had to tame and yoke 2 colossal bronze bulls that breathed fire from their nostrils and possessed mighty copper hooves. Then, using these fire-breathing creatures, he was to plough a vast field and sow it with dragon's teeth. From these teeth, it was foretold, armed warriors would sprout, whom Jason was obligated to defeat before sunset. This trial, as everyone well knew, was designed with the sole purpose of destroying the hero. Previous contenders had been mercilessly trampled and burned by the bronze bulls. The warriors, born from dragon's teeth, were renowned for their ferocity, impeccable coordination, and absolute ruthlessness. It was evident that no mortal could survive such monstrous trials. However, against all expectations, Jason found an unexpected patron in Medea, the king's daughter, renowned for her profound knowledge of magic and healing herbs. She had watched the arriving hero closely since his first appearance in Colchis, and something in his fearlessness and unwavering commitment to his purpose touched her heart. Medea was by no means an ordinary princess, passively awaiting rescue. She possessed an exceptional mind, immense power, and extensive knowledge of such potent forces that most mortals feared even to contemplate. Her sorcery could both heal and harm, protect and destroy, and she made a firm decision to use her abilities to support this foreign prince who had travelled so far to achieve what everyone else considered absolutely impossible. Medea provided Jason with a magical ointment, intended to reliably protect him from the bulls' scorching fiery breath and the crushing blows of their bronze hooves. She also revealed to him the secret of how to defeat the army spawned by the dragon's teeth. He merely had to throw a stone into their midst, and the warriors, consumed by insane fury, would immediately turn their weapons against each other, forgetting their original target. And most crucially, she solemnly promised to help him bypass the ever-wakeful dragon that tirelessly guarded the Golden Fleece itself. The trials unfolded exactly as Medea had foretold. Protected by her miraculous ointment, Jason managed not only to tame the fierce bronze bulls, but also to yoke them and then plough the designated field. When armed warriors burst forth from the freshly ploughed furrows with a formidable roar, the hero, following advice, hurled a stone directly into their dense ranks. Instantly consumed by furious rage, they turned their weapons against each other and fought with such ferocity that they ultimately annihilated themselves. King Aeetes was beside himself with fury, seeing Jason successfully complete all the tasks. However, bound by his public promise, he could not openly renege on it. Nevertheless, he had no true intention of giving up the Golden Fleece. The king immediately began to devise a cunning plan, to launch a night attack on the Argonauts and ruthlessly dispatch them all while they slept. Medea, who understood her father's intentions with far greater insight than anyone else, had already warned Jason of the impending treachery. That very night she led him to the sacred grove where the Golden Fleece rested on the branches of an ancient oak, tirelessly guarded by a dragon that had never known sleep. The monster sensed their approach long before they reached the mighty tree. Its colossal head slowly rose from the coil of its body, and amber eyes full of malevolent intelligence stared intently at the intruders. The dragon uttered not a sound. It did not roar or hiss as lesser creatures might. Its true threat lay in its absolute stillness, in its patient, waiting readiness to strike a devastating blow. Then Medea began to sing, an ancient melody in a language that was probably older than Greek, perhaps even older than any known human tongue. It was a magical lullaby, addressing the deepest, most archaic parts of the mind, those corners of the psyche that hold memories of serene childhood, of feeling safe in gentle, loving embraces. The dragon's head began to sway slowly, as if the colossal creature was fighting a sensation it had never known before. Its amber eyes, which had never closed, grew noticeably heavy. The coils of its mighty body loosened as the muscles, which had been in constant tension for decades, finally began to relax. For the first time in its ancient existence, this tireless guardian fell into a deep sleep. Jason climbed the ancient oak with utmost caution, barely daring to breathe as his hand reached for the coveted golden fleece. The moment his fingers touched it, the fleece felt warm, as if the life force of the magical ram from which it originated still pulsed within it. It was surprisingly weightless and seemed to emit its own internal glow. With the fleece held securely, Jason silently descended from the tree and followed Medea out of the enchanted grove. Behind them, deep in slumber, lay the dragon, experiencing dreams that no other creature before it had been destined to experience. The journey home proved no less perilous than the voyage to Colchis itself, now compounded by the fact that King Aeetes had dispatched a fleet of ships in pursuit to reclaim his daughter and deal with the thieves of his priceless treasure. However, that is an entirely different story, replete with its own dramatic events and heartaches. For now, it is important to emphasize that Jason accomplished a feat that everyone without exception believed to be impossible. He obtained the Golden Fleece, a treasure guarded by a creature that never knew rest, never relaxed its vigilance, never allowed anyone the slightest opportunity to approach. Sometimes the most formidable guardian can be overcome not by brute force or sophisticated cunning, but by offering it something it has never had. In this particular case, the invaluable gift of sleep. It was a rest vital to every living creature, but one that this dragon was deprived of by the very nature of its unrelenting duty. Such an outcome makes one ponder deeply what other, seemingly impossible tasks might be solved. Not through intensified confrontation or superior intellect, but through a profound understanding of the guardian's true needs and finding a way to satisfy them. A deep understanding of what drives us when we undertake seemingly insurmountable tasks was known to Heracles better than anyone else, though this knowledge came at an incredibly high price, almost destroying the hero himself. His tragic story serves as a harsh reminder that sometimes our greatest virtues and our deepest flaws stem from the same original source. Redemption, in turn, often requires far greater effort and sacrifice than we initially believe we are capable of enduring. Heracles was born with strength that far surpassed all conceivable human limits. Even as an infant, he effortlessly strangled 2 venomous snakes sent to kill him in his cradle, doing so with carefree laughter, as if enjoying a game. As he grew, his extraordinary strength grew with him, reaching such a level that he could easily lift gigantic boulders, a task that would challenge a dozen ordinary men. He was capable of fighting lions bare-handed and bending iron bars with the same ease with which an ordinary person would bend a flower stem. However, alongside this colossal physical power, he harbored a temper equally mighty, but far more dangerous. When Heracles fell into a rage, he did not merely raise his voice or hastily leave the room, as most people do. His anger was akin to a natural disaster, sudden, all-consuming, and immensely destructive. For many years, Heracles successfully managed to curb this dangerous aspect of his character. He married a beautiful woman named Megara, and they had children. It seemed that the hero had finally found the peaceful family haven that could tame the wild, untamed essence of his heart. He proved to be a tender and loving father, treating his children with surprising gentleness despite his colossal strength, and a devoted husband who daily strived to justify the trust and love of his family. However, the goddess Hera, who harbored an unquenchable hatred for Heracles from the moment of his birth, for he was the son of her husband Zeus by another woman, devised a plan to destroy this happiness he had found in the most exquisitely cruel way. She inflicted upon Heracles an attack of all-consuming madness, a rage so boundless that the hero completely lost all understanding of who he was and what he was doing. When the veil of madness finally lifted, Heracles found himself amidst a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his frenzied fury, he had personally taken the lives of his wife and children, the very people he loved above all else. His colossal strength, intended for their protection, had paradoxically become the instrument of their demise. The bitterness and unbearable guilt that followed this monstrous deed almost completed his utter destruction. For several days, Heracles remained in a stupor, sitting among the debris of his former shattered happiness, completely unable to eat, sleep, or even speak. How could one continue to live, knowing that you yourself had destroyed everything you had ever valued and cherished? How could one even exist when the deepest and most hidden fear you harbored for yourself had become a cruel and undeniable reality? Ultimately, in a desperate search for a path to atone for his actions, Heracles sought advice from the famous oracle at Delphi. The prophecy uttered by the priestess was harsh and merciless, yet it offered a thin thread of hope. Heracles was destined to serve his cowardly cousin, King Eurystheus, for 12 years, meticulously carrying out any tasks the king wished to give him. Only after completing this arduous service could he hope to achieve purification from his horrific crime. King Eurystheus was the perfect embodiment of one who might gain power over such an outstanding hero as Heracles. He was a petty man, consumed by jealousy, and openly cruel. Yet he possessed enough shrewdness to recognize the danger posed by Heracles' immense strength, and was so cowardly that he sought not to use this power for good, but to destroy it. It was for this reason that Eurystheus devised a series of 12 grand labors. Each was conceived as utterly impossible, and each was intended to lead to Heracles' demise in the most horrible and agonizing way. If, by some miracle, the hero managed to survive one trial, the next promised to be even more ruthless and deadly. The first of these trials involved killing the Nemean lion, a creature whose hide was so incredibly tough that no known weapon could penetrate it. Arrows shot at the beast harmlessly bounced off, like small pebbles. Swords striking its thick fur broke, and spears shattered upon impact. Ultimately, Heracles had to resort to his primal strength and strangle the monster with his bare hands. This exhausting struggle lasted an entire day, leaving the hero completely spent, but undoubtedly victorious. The second labor required the destruction of the Lernaean Hydra, a serpentine monster with numerous heads that, when severed, grew back twice as large. Each time Heracles cut off a head with his sword, 2 new ones immediately appeared in its place, until he found himself facing a writhing mass of snapping jaws and venomous fangs. The hero found a solution to this monstrous problem by instructing his nephew to cauterize each neck stump with a torch immediately after decapitation, thereby preventing further growth. This was one of the few times Heracles accepted help in his labors, and it taught him a valuable lesson. Sometimes brute force alone is not enough. wisdom and the art of cooperation are also necessary. The third labor led him into the mountain ranges, where he had to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred animal of the goddess Artemis. This task required not physical strength, but exceptional patience and considerable persistence, as Heracles had to pursue this swift-footed creature for an entire year before he could finally catch it without causing any harm, a condition that greatly complicated an already difficult task. Each subsequent labor brought new, unique challenges that tested different facets of Heracles' character. He had to capture the enormous Erymanthian boar alive. He cleaned the Aegean stables which housed thousands of cattle and had never been cleaned. He drove away the man-eating Stymphalian birds, tamed the fire-breathing mares of Diomedes, and finally acquired the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Some of these tasks required the development of diplomatic skills that Heracles had not previously employed. Others demanded cunning and strategic planning rather than simply applying brute force. The hero who had once relied solely on his physical might gradually learned to use his mind, his heart, and his ability to interact with others. However, the most difficult and dangerous labors still awaited him. The 10th task required the theft of the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant who lived at the westernmost edge of the world. To reach Geryon's island, Heracles had to cross the vast expanse of the ocean. Along the way, he erected the famous Pillars of Heracles, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, to mark the furthest point of the then-known world. The 11th labor sent him to the mysterious garden of the Hesperides, where he was to steal the golden apples. These fruits bestowed immortality upon anyone who ate them, and they were guarded not only by the Hesperides themselves, nymphs who sang as they tended the trees, but also by a 100-headed dragon named Ladon. To accomplish this task, Heracles had to persuade the Titan Atlas to assist him. Atlas, who held the sky as punishment for his role in an ancient rebellion against the gods, agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles would temporarily take on his insurmountable burden. Thus, for a brief moment, Heracles stood at the edge of the world, feeling the full weight of the heavens on his shoulders, comprehending what it meant to bear a responsibility that could never be set down. The 12th and final labor proved the most impossible of all, to descend into the gloomy realm of the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog guarding the gates of the dead. No living person had ever entered Hades' realm and returned, and Cerberus had never been defeated by any hero or monster. However, by this point, Heracles had been transformed from the rage-filled man who began these labors 12 years prior. He had learned patience by pursuing the Ceryneian hind, diplomacy from his encounters with the Amazons, humility from his time supporting the sky. When he approached Hades and Persephone and asked permission to attempt to capture Cerberus, he did so with deep respect, not arrogance. Hades agreed to let him try, but with one absolute condition. Heracles had to subdue Cerberus using only his own strength, without weapons and without anyone's help. This became the ultimate test of everything he had learned during his years of service. The battle between Heracles and Cerberus was epic in its essence, yet surprisingly quiet. There was no thunderous roaring, no dramatic posturing, just the patient application of strength against strength, endurance against endurance. Heracles wrapped his arms around the great dog's necks and held on tight. It didn't matter how fiercely the monster thrashed, or how desperately it tried to shake him off. Eventually, Cerberus realized that this man would not let go, would not give up, would not be intimidated or worn down. And with something that could only be interpreted as respect, the guardian of the underworld allowed himself to be led into the world of the living. When Heracles presented Cerberus to King Eurystheus, the cowardly ruler, upon glimpsing the three-headed monster, immediately granted Heracles his freedom. The 12 labors were complete. The debt of atonement had been paid, and the hero was finally entitled to live his own life. But this is the amazing thing about tasks that change a person. Once you've completed them, you're no longer the person who started them. Heracles, who completed the 12 labors, was not the same man who began them in grief and guilt 12 years earlier. He had learned that true strength does not come from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when not to use one's power. He discovered that the hardest battles are often fought not against external monsters, but against the parts of oneself that one likes least. And he understood that redemption is not a destination you reach, but rather a journey, a choice you make every day to use your gifts in service of something greater than yourself. The 12 labors of Heracles serve as a reminder that sometimes the tasks that seem designed to destroy us actually teach us who we truly are and who we can become. The question of who we can become was one that Sisyphus, in his own conviction, had definitively answered. He genuinely believed he possessed enough cunning to outsmart anyone, including the gods themselves. His story serves as a stark reminder that there are contests where victory is undesirable, and some triumphs that prove to be defeats in disguise. Sisyphus was the king of Corinth, and throughout Greece he was known for his exceptional cunning and sharp mind. He founded his city and brought it to prosperity through a combination of strategic thinking and ruthless pragmatism. He was the kind of ruler who always seemed 3 steps ahead of everyone else, who could find an advantage or benefit in any situation. However, Sisyphus had one fatal flaw. He couldn't resist the temptation to show off how clever he was, even when it would have been far wiser to keep his mouth shut and his schemes to himself. He was like a chess master who couldn't help but explain all his brilliant moves to his opponents, even when it revealed his strategy. Trouble began when Sisyphus witnessed something he shouldn't have seen. Zeus, the supreme king of the gods, had taken the form of an eagle to abduct the river nymph Aegina. Her father, the river god Asopus, searched everywhere for his missing daughter and eventually turned to Sisyphus for help. At that moment, the wise thing for Sisyphus to do would have been to claim complete ignorance. After all, what mortal king wants to meddle in disputes between gods? But Sisyphus saw an opportunity to gain a powerful ally, and couldn't resist the chance to demonstrate how much he knew. "I saw what happened to your daughter," Sisyphus declared to Asopus. "Zeus took her, but if you wish to have this information, I need something in return. Create a fresh water spring for my city, and I will tell you where he took her." It seemed like a truly brilliant deal. Asopus created the spring, Sisyphus revealed Zeus's crime, and Corinth gained a vital water source. However, Sisyphus made the classic mistake of naively believing that he could manipulate forces far greater than himself without any consequences. Zeus was far from pleased to learn that a mortal king had betrayed his secret and set an enraged river god upon him. He decided that Sisyphus needed to be taught a lesson about the dangers of being too clever for one's own good. Zeus sent death itself to take Sisyphus and bring him to the underworld. But even in the face of the ultimate fate that awaits all mortals, Sisyphus couldn't resist trying to outsmart his opponent. When death arrived at the palace in Corinth, Sisyphus greeted her with apparent submission. "I suppose my time has come," he said with feigned sadness. "I am ready to go with you, but tell me, these chains you carry, how exactly do they work? I've heard they are unbreakable, but I've never seen them up close." Death, proud of her equipment, gladly demonstrated. "You see, once these chains are locked, no force in the universe can break them. Here, let me show you how they fasten." And faster than Death could react, Sisyphus snapped the chains around Death herself. With Death bound in her unbreakable shackles, no living creature could find its end anywhere. This was a complete and unprecedented disruption of the natural order of things. At first, Sisyphus rejoiced, triumphant in his own cunning. He had managed to trick Death herself, accomplishing a feat beyond any mortal. However, with time, the harmful consequences of his audacious act became glaringly obvious. Without Death to take the old and infirm, the world began to plunge into a pit of unbearable suffering. People who rightfully deserved rest in the embrace of Death were condemned to a tormenting continuation of their existence in pain and helplessness. Warriors who fell on battlefields could not die, and so they lay on the ground with horrific wounds, unable to heal or find release. The gods were not merely indignant but deeply concerned. The entire cosmic order depended on the delicate cycle of life and death, and without Death to balance life, the universe itself was threatened with complete collapse. Eventually, Ares, the mighty god of war, descended to Corinth to resolve this critical situation. He freed Death from her chains and personally escorted Sisyphus to the grim realm of Hades. But even then, Sisyphus had one more cunning plan. Before going to the underworld, he instructed his wife not to perform the proper burial rites for him under any circumstances. Upon arriving in the realm of the dead, he immediately complained to Hades about a blatant violation of sacred laws. "My wife has dishonored me," Sisyphus indignantly declared. "She did not bury me properly. Can you expect me to remain in the underworld when I was not sent here according to ancient traditions?" Hades, being a strict adherent to proper procedures, agreed that this indeed presented a serious problem. He granted Sisyphus permission to return to the world of the living just long enough to arrange his own proper funeral. However, no sooner had he returned to Corinth than Sisyphus had no intention of voluntarily returning to the realm of the dead. He lived for many more years, enjoying every moment of life and boasting about how he had outsmarted Death, not once, but twice. Ultimately, of course, relentless old age caught up with him, and when he died a natural death, there was no escaping his fate. But by that time the gods had decided that ordinary punishment would not suffice for one who had caused so much trouble and shown such blatant disregard for the established order of nature. Sisyphus was condemned to a very special form of eternal torment. He was given an endless task to push a massive boulder up a mountain. The catch was that each time he almost reached the summit, the stone would slip and roll back down, forcing him to start all over again. Imagine the scene. Sisyphus presses his shoulder against the massive stone, feeling its colossal weight and rough surface, beginning the slow, grueling ascent up the mountain slope. His muscles strain to their limit, his breathing becomes ragged and short, sweat streams down his face and into his eyes. Step by step, inch by inch, he forces the boulder higher up the slope. As he climbs, he sees the hilltop drawing closer, A timid hope begins to stir in his heart that this time will be different, that this time he will truly manage to get the stone all the way to the top. He pushes harder, ignoring the burning pain in his back and shoulders, concentrating all his energy on those last few feet. And then, just as he is about to succeed, the boulder breaks free from his control and tumbles back down with a crash. Sisyphus must watch all his progress disappear. He must accept that all his efforts were in vain, and he must begin the whole unbearable process anew. This punishment was perfectly suited to Sisyphus's character. He had always been driven by an insatiable desire to win, to be smarter than everyone else, to accomplish what others could not. Now he was trapped in a task where victory was fundamentally impossible, where cunning was utterly useless, and his sharp intellect gave him no advantage. But this is where the story takes an unexpected and profound turn. After countless ages of pushing his boulder, something changed in Sisyphus. He began to find a strange tranquility in this unending repetition, a rhythm that was almost meditative. He started to notice things he had never paid attention to before, how the light changed on the mountainside throughout the day, the small wild flowers pushing through the rocks, the feel of his muscles working in concert to move the massive stone. He began to take pride not in reaching the summit, which he knew perfectly well was impossible, but in the quality of his effort, the unwavering steadfastness of his resolve. Some philosophers suggest that in his eternal labour, Sisyphus discovered something that had eluded him in his cunning and intriguing life. It was the satisfaction that comes not from outsmarting others or achieving impossible victories, but from simply performing one's work with dignity and perseverance, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Perhaps the real punishment was not the endless toil, but the realization of what his life could have been like if he had learned earlier to find meaning in the process itself, rather than focusing solely on results. Or perhaps the punishment gradually transformed into a kind of gift, a chance to discover that even in the most hopeless situation, one can find purpose and even a certain satisfaction. The myth of Sisyphus serves as a powerful reminder to humanity that sometimes the very qualities we believe make us superior, our cunning, our ability to find loopholes and shortcuts, our determination to win at all costs, can become the sources of our greatest suffering. And sometimes the tasks that seem most meaningless are precisely those that teach us the most about what truly matters. Each of us has our own boulders to push, our own hills to climb, our own tasks that seem to restart just as we think we're making progress. The question is not whether we will succeed in the way we initially hoped, but whether we will find a way to push our stone with dignity, with conscious purpose, and perhaps even with joy. Finding joy in the most impossible circumstances is something Daedalus understood better than most, though his story demonstrates that sometimes the very solutions people create to escape their problems can become the source of even greater tragedy. His narrative is a profound tale of genius and love, of innovation and loss, and of the heavy burden of unforeseen consequences. Daedalus was the greatest inventor and craftsman who ever lived. His hands could shape any material into any form he could imagine, and his creative imagination seemed boundless. He created mechanical servants capable of performing the most complex tasks, fountains that played melodic music as water flowed through them, and sculptures so lifelike that people would talk to them, expecting a reply. His workshop was a marvel, filled with half-finished projects and brilliant innovations. Gears and pulleys hung from the ceiling next to detailed sketches of flying machines. Workbenches were littered with models of buildings defying traditional architecture, devices capable of measuring time or predicting weather, and even toys that moved on their own, as if they were living creatures. However, Daedalus's greatest creation was not a machine or an architectural marvel. It was his son, Icarus. Of course, he wasn't literally created, but shaped and moulded by years of patient teaching and gentle guidance. Icarus possessed his father's curiosity and sharp mind, though he lacked the patience and wisdom acquired by an older man. One could imagine them working together in the workshop, Daedalus showing his son how to join pieces of wood so they would never come apart, how to temper metal until it reached perfect sharpness, how to observe birds in flight and understand the principles that kept them aloft. Icarus listened intently, his young face serious with concentration, asking endless questions about why things worked the way they did. Their peaceful life was disrupted when King Minos of Crete summoned Daedalus to his court. The king had a serious problem. His wife had given birth to a monster named the Minotaur, half man, half bull, and he needed a secure place to keep it confined. Note, not to kill it, but to imprison it in such a way that it would not terrorize his people, yet could continue to live. Daedalus designed and built the labyrinth, a structure so intricate and bewildering that anyone who entered it would become hopelessly lost. Passages twisted and turned back, led to dead ends, opened into chambers that seemed to offer an exit, but actually led deeper into the labyrinth's depths. In its center, the Minotaur lived in a kind of peaceful captivity, fed and cared for, but utterly unable to find its way out. The labyrinth became a true masterpiece of engineering and psychology, accounting not only for the physical challenge of navigation, but also for the profound mental effects of prolonged confusion and disorientation. It was designed not merely to be impassable, but to ensure that anyone trapped within its walls would gradually lose all hope of ever finding freedom. For several years, Daedalus and Icarus lived comfortably in Crete. As honored guests of King Minos, Daedalus continued his work, creating new inventions and solving complex problems for the royal court. Icarus grew from a boy into a young man, learning his father's skills and developing his own interests and talents. But then something happened that changed everything. The hero Theseus arrived in Crete and, with the help of the king's daughter Ariadne, managed to navigate the labyrinth, kill the Minotaur, and successfully escape the island. King Minos, consumed by burning rage, suffered not only from the loss of the legendary Minotaur, but also from the bitter realization that his seemingly impenetrable prison had been brazenly overcome. In a fit of uncontrollable anger, Minos hastily blamed Daedalus for the labyrinth's failure. How else could Theseus have succeeded unless the labyrinth's creator himself had somehow revealed its innermost secrets? This accusation was entirely unjust. Daedalus had no involvement in Theseus's triumph, yet justice was a concept King Minos rarely cared for when consumed by wrath. As a harsh punishment, Minos imprisoned Daedalus and his son Icarus in a tall tower located on a small, secluded island off the coast of Crete. This tower rose, isolated on all sides by water, with no accessible boat and no possibility of swimming to safety. The king naively believed that even the great inventor Daedalus could not escape confinement in such an impregnable prison. For several agonizing weeks, father and son languished in their tower cell, subsisting on meager food brought to them only once a day. They watched the sun majestically rise and set through their single window, tormentingly wondering if they were destined to spend the rest of their days in this captivity. Daedalus spent his time studying the birds that nested in the tower walls, carefully observing how they skillfully used their wings to glide on air currents, and how they could soar for hours without tiring. Icarus, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless from the confinement. He was young and full of energy, accustomed to activity, to working on projects and constantly learning. The forced idleness proved almost more unbearable than the imprisonment itself. He paced the small chamber, stared out the window for hours, and bombarded his father with questions about when they would be released and how they could escape. It was on one of these long, languid days that an epiphany came to Daedalus. He watched a seagull soaring outside their window, its wings barely moving as it lifted on the updraft from the warm rocks below. Suddenly he realized what he had to do. "We cannot leave here by foot," he told Icarus, "and we cannot swim away. But there is one path Minos has not blocked: the sky itself." Working with materials found in their cell and in the tower around them, Daedalus set about constructing 2 pairs of wings. He gathered feathers shed by birds nesting in the walls, starting with the tiniest downy feathers and progressing to the long, strong flight feathers that provided lift and control. The construction was painstaking work, requiring all of Daedalus's craftsmanship and patience. Each feather had to be precisely placed, secured with thread unravelled from their clothing, and wax melted from the candles that illuminated their cell. The wings had to be light enough to allow flight, yet strong enough to support a human body, flexible enough to respond to air currents, yet rigid enough to provide stable lift. Icarus helped with the construction, but it was clear his heart wasn't fully in the painstaking, methodical work. He yearned to test the wings, to try them, to feel the freedom of flight. While his father double-checked every joint and tested every hinge, Icarus dreamed of soaring high above the island, feeling the wind beneath his wings, experiencing the exhilaration of escaping their prison by air. When the wings were finally ready, Daedalus spent an entire day teaching his son how to use them. They practiced on the floor of their cell, learning how to move their arms to create lift, how to shift their weight to turn, how to read the signs that would tell them which way the wind was blowing. "Remember," Daedalus repeated over and over, "fly at a moderate height, not too low, or the sea spray will wet your wings and make them heavy, but not too high either. The sun's heat will melt the wax that holds the feathers in place. Stay close to me, follow my path, and do not try to be clever or boastful. This is about survival, not adventure." Icarus nodded and promised to follow his father's instructions precisely. But even as he made these promises, one could see the excitement in his eyes, a barely contained impatience to experience what no human had ever experienced before. The morning they chose for their escape was perfect for flying. Clear skies, a moderate wind, good visibility in all directions. Daedalus helped his son strap on his wings, checked all the fastenings one last time, and then put on his own. For a moment they stood together at the window of their tower, father and son, about to attempt something that defied all laws of nature. The first moments of flight were magical. The wings worked exactly as Daedalus had calculated, catching the air and lifting them up and away from their prison tower. Below them, the island of Crete spread out like a detailed map, with its harbours and towns, mountains and valleys, all looking peaceful and miniature from their elevated vantage point. Icarus laughed with pure joy, feeling himself soaring through the air. It was a freedom beyond anything he had ever imagined. The ability to go anywhere, to see everything from an entirely new perspective, to move in 3 dimensions instead of being tied to the ground like every other human who had ever lived. For a while everything went according to plan. Father and son flew steadily away from Crete, maintaining a moderate altitude, following the path Daedalus had charted over weeks of planning. They flew over small islands, fishing boats, merchant ships whose crews pointed at them in amazement. But gradually Icarus's excitement and exhilaration began to outweigh his caution. The sensation of flight was so incredible, so intoxicating, that he wanted to experience it more. He began to experiment, flying higher, diving lower, performing turns and loops his father had never taught him. Daedalus shouted warnings, trying to get his son's attention, reminding him of the dangers of flying too high or too low. But his voice was lost in the wind, and Icarus was too engrossed in the joy of flight to pay attention to anything else. Higher and higher Icarus flew, drawn by the sun's warmth and the incredible view that opened up as he gained altitude. The world below became a patchwork of blues, greens and browns, indescribably beautiful. He felt as if he could see forever, as if he understood the earth's secrets that no ground-bound human could ever know. What Icarus failed to notice in his excitement was that the wax holding his wings together had begun to soften from the sun's heat. The feathers began to loosen, then one by one flew away. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. The wings that had so triumphantly carried him skyward began to disintegrate. Feathers scattered on the wind like snow, and suddenly Icarus found himself falling, no longer supported by the artificial wings his father had so carefully crafted. Daedalus, flying lower, looked up just in time to see his son plummeting into the sea. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't fly fast enough to catch him. He couldn't repair the damaged wings in mid-air. He couldn't prevent the tragedy unfolding above him. Icarus plunged into the blue waters of the Aegean Sea, and the waves closed over him as if he had never existed. The only traces left were a few scattered feathers floating on the surface, and the sound of a father's cry of grief echoing across the empty sky. Daedalus landed on the nearest island, removed his wings, and for several days searched the shore for any trace of his son. Eventually, Icarus's body washed ashore, and Daedalus buried him there with his own hands, building a monument that would mark the place where the first man to fly fell to earth. The story of Daedalus and Icarus reminds us that every gift comes with responsibility, every freedom with limits. The very thing that can save us, be it our intellect, our creativity, or our bravery, can also destroy us if we do not respect its power and understand its boundaries. Sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when we are struggling against our limitation, but when we have just broken free from them and feel that anything is possible. It is then that we need wisdom most, and it is then that it is often hardest to remember that even the sky has limits that we cross at our peril. The boundaries we cross often seem insignificant at the moment, like a simple choice between 3 beautiful gifts, but they can set in motion events that will change the entire world. This was certainly true for a young shepherd named Paris, who made a decision that seemed easy enough at the time, but ultimately led to the launch of 1,000 ships and the destruction of 2 great cities. Paris was not meant to make momentous decisions. In fact, he wasn't meant to be alive at all. When he was born to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, the royal seers prophesied that this child would one day be the cause of Troy's downfall. The prophecy was so dire, so specific, that the king and queen had no choice but to order the infant killed. But the servant tasked with killing the child couldn't bring himself to harm an innocent baby. Instead, he left Paris on Mount Ida, hoping the elements would do what he could not. It was meant to be a more merciful death than outright murder, but death nonetheless. A quiet beginning to a stormy fate. Contrary to the grim predictions, Paris did not meet his end. He was found and adopted into the family of simple shepherds living on the slopes of majestic Mount Ida. These unassuming people, whose lives were far removed from royal intrigues and prophetic predictions, raised the boy as their own son. They taught him the ancient art of herding sheep, reading the signs of the changing weather, finding shelter from fierce storms, and living a quiet, unpretentious life in harmony with nature. For 20 years, Paris remained blissfully unaware of his true royal identity. He was convinced he was merely the son of an ordinary shepherd, and this humble role suited him perfectly. His days were spent tending flocks of sheep and goats, playing melodic tunes on his flute while the animals grazed peacefully. He spent his nights under the boundless starry sky when the weather was favourable, or sought refuge in simple huts when powerful. Storms shook the mountain passes. It was a life devoid of luxury and excess, but free from the heavy burdens and immense responsibilities that inevitably accompany power. An unexpected encounter on Mount Ida. Paris, thanks to his constant outdoor work, possessed enviable strength and endurance. He was handsome, as is often the case with young men leading a healthy and active lifestyle. Nature had endowed him with a special, innate charm that made both animals and people instinctively trust him. And so, one day, as Paris was tending his flocks in a peaceful meadow high on Mount Ida, 3 majestic figures suddenly appeared before him. They were certainly not shepherds, nor travellers, nor anyone else one would expect to meet in such a remote and secluded place. These were the 3 most powerful goddesses of the Greek pantheon. Hera, the majestic queen of the gods and patroness of sacred marital bonds. Athena, the wise goddess of war and reason, and Aphrodite, the embodiment of love and ethereal beauty. Each glowed with splendor beyond human description, radiating such power and divinity that it was utterly impossible to mistake them for mortal beings. The apple of discord and the wisdom of Zeus. Despite their obvious grandeur and otherworldly radiance, the 3 goddesses seemed to be in the midst of a heated argument. Their voices were sharp and tense, and their energetic gestures eloquently indicated that each was desperately trying to prove something the others clearly did not wish to hear. The source of their deep disagreement was a golden apple that Hera held tightly in her hand. Engraved on its surface was the inscription, "To the fairest." This apple had been cunningly thrown among them during a wedding feast by Eris, the goddess of discord, who was greatly angered at not being invited to the celebration. Each goddess, naturally, was convinced that she was the fairest, and therefore the rightful owner of the coveted apple. However, none was willing to concede to the other, and their dispute had gone on so long that it now threatened to disrupt the sacred harmony of Olympus itself. Eventually, Zeus, the supreme god, was forced to intervene, but he did not resolve the dispute himself. for that would require him to choose between his own wife, daughter, and half-sister. Instead, he decided to delegate this difficult decision to a mortal judge who could not be accused of divine favoritism. "You," Hera said, pointing to Paris, who still stood with his mouth agape, trying to comprehend the incredible events unfolding. "You shall decide which of us deserves this apple." The weight of an unexpected choice. Paris shifted his gaze from one goddess to another, and his shepherd's common sense told him this was precisely the situation a wise man would try to avoid at all costs. How could he choose between three beings who could destroy him with a mere thought if they disliked his decision? "I am merely a shepherd," Paris stammered, his voice trembling. "Surely someone more qualified." "The decision is made," Athena sharply interrupted. "Zeus himself has chosen you as judge. You cannot refuse this duty." What followed was less a beauty contest than a series of increasingly tempting, bordering on bribery, offers. Each goddess, well aware that this simple shepherd held incredible power over their eternal reputations, began to offer him gifts that could transform his humble life beyond recognition. Hera spoke first, her voice carrying all the authority of her position as Queen of the Gods. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you ruler of all Europe and Asia. You will command countless armies, govern prosperous cities, and will be remembered as one of the greatest kings who ever lived. No mortal will be able to resist your will." The temptations of power and wisdom. This was truly an incredible offer, enough to make any mortal's head spin. Paris could envision himself in shining golden armor, standing before the gates of conquered cities, accepting the submission of vanquished foes. He saw himself enacting wise laws, commissioning great works of art and architecture, leaving behind a legacy that would last millennia. But before he could even respond, Athena stepped forward. "Power without wisdom is meaningless and dangerous," she declared. "Choose me, and I will grant you wisdom surpassing that of any mortal, and certain victory in every battle you ever wage. You will be invincible in war, unsurpassed in strategy, and will be remembered not only as a great conqueror, but as the wisest ruler who ever lived on earth." This offer proved even more tempting than Hera's generous promise. What good is immense power if you don't know how to wield it wisely? What's the point of ruling if you make foolish decisions that bring only suffering to your people? With Athena's gifts, Paris could be not just successful, but truly great and revered. The promise of love, and Helen of Sparta. But then Aphrodite, the goddess of love, smiled, and her smile was like bright sunlight breaking through thick clouds after a long and arduous storm. "My sisters offer you things that will bring you only burdens and heavy responsibilities," she softly said, her voice as gentle as a whisper of wind. "Choose me, and I will give you something far simpler and immeasurably more precious. The love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta will be yours, and with her will come a happiness that no power or wisdom can provide." Paris, of course, had heard of Helen. Even simple shepherds passed stories by word of mouth about the Spartan queen whose beauty was so extraordinary that it seemed almost supernatural, divine. Poets composed inspired verses about her. Artists tried to capture her image on canvases, and young men across Greece dreamed of catching even a glimpse of her. The choice should have been obvious. Power and wisdom were certainly impressive gifts, but they inevitably came with obligations and complexities. Helen, on the other hand, represented love in its purest, unadulterated form. The joy of finding someone who completes you, who makes every day brighter simply by their existence. The fatal choice and its consequences. Paris did not consider that Helen was already married to the mighty king Menelaus of Sparta. He did not think about what might happen when the most beautiful woman in the world disappeared from her homeland. He did not question why Aphrodite was even able to make such a bold offer, or what its fulfillment might cost. He thought only of love, of ethereal beauty, of the happiness that seemed to shine in Aphrodite's eyes, like a promise of everything he had never dared to hope for. "I choose Aphrodite," Paris declared, and handed her the golden apple. The consequences of this decision were immediate and catastrophic. Hera and Athena, enraged by the refusal, became Paris's eternal enemies, and consequently, implacable foes of Troy itself. They immediately began to plot the destruction of the city that had produced this shepherd, who dared to judge them as inferior to the goddess of love. Aphrodite, true to her word, arranged for Paris to travel to Sparta, where he was welcomed as an honored guest by King Menelaus. During his stay, Helen fell deeply and passionately in love with the handsome young guest, just as the goddess had promised. But love forged by divine magic is different from love that grows naturally between two people. It is more intense, more overwhelming, and cares less for consequences or responsibility. Helen left her husband, her daughter, and her kingdom to sail with Paris to Troy, never looking back at what she left behind. The beginning of the Trojan War. When Menelaus discovered that his wife had been taken by his Trojan guest, his grief and fury knew no bounds. But he was not angry alone. Helen had been courted by virtually all the princes and kings of Greece before she married Menelaus, and all her former suitors had sworn an oath to protect her marriage and assist her husband if anyone ever tried to take her away. This oath, which at the time seemed merely a formality, now became the foundation of the greatest military alliance the ancient world had ever seen. One by one, the kings and heroes of Greece fulfilled their sacred obligation, gathering vast armies and numerous ships for what would become known as the Trojan War. For 10 long years the Greeks besieged Troy, and the war that began with Paris's simple choice consumed an entire generation. Heroes died in bloody battles, prosperous cities were razed to the ground, families were torn apart, and the very fabric of civilization in the eastern Mediterranean was shredded. In the end, Troy fell, just as the ancient prophecy had foretold. King Priam was killed, Queen Hecuba was enslaved, and the great city that had stood for centuries was reduced to smoking ruins. Paris himself died in battle, struck down by an arrow that found him just as he began to realize the true, exorbitant price of the choice he had made in that peaceful meadow years ago. The lesson of Paris's judgment. The story of the judgment of Paris serves as an important reminder that some choices, which at the moment seem simple and purely personal, can have consequences that extend far beyond anything we could have imagined. When we choose based solely on our immediate desires, without considering the broader and long-term implications of our decisions, we can unleash forces capable of destroying not only ourselves but everyone around us. Sometimes the most important thing about a choice is not what we get from it, but what we are willing to sacrifice for it, and whether we have considered what that sacrifice might cost other people who never had a say in our fateful decision. The stories of people whose lives were scarred by the actions of others invariably resonate through the ages. This theme echoes particularly clearly in the final act of the legendary Trojan War, where a majestic city, impregnably besieged for an entire decade, ultimately fell not to brute force or heroic valor, but to a cunning trick. This treacherous triumph inadvertently raises a profound philosophical question. Can a victory achieved through deceit and trickery be considered a true victory? When the war, inadvertently started by Paris, entered its 10th summer, both warring parties had reached an extreme state of exhaustion. The Achaeans, having camped on the coastal sands near Troy for a full decade, were far from their homes and loved ones, slowly aging on foreign soil, embroiled in a conflict that seemed to have no end. The Trojans, in turn, had been confined within their mighty city walls for just as long, anxiously watching their provisions dwindle and their young men perish in continuous battles. The great heroes whose exploits had lent such dramatic flair to the early years of the war had by this point mostly departed the world of the living. The invulnerable Achilles had fallen, struck in his only vulnerable spot, his heel, by Paris's arrow. Hector, Troy's incomparable defender, had been killed by Achilles in revenge for Patroclus's death. Mighty Ajax had taken his own life in a fit of madness and unbearable shame. Even Paris himself had vanished from the battlefield, his demise barely noticed amidst many other, far more significant losses. On the battlefield remained only exhausted, greying warriors, whose sole desire was to return to their homelands. Their leaders, who had invested an immense amount of resources and years of their lives in this conflict, could not simply abandon it, though they had long since lost their initial understanding of what was even worth fighting for. The Greek camp, sprawled along the coast, had, over a decade, transformed into a semi-permanent settlement, a miniature city composed of tents and hastily erected temporary structures, complete with its own markets, workshops, and social hierarchy. Men who had arrived there as young, vigorous warriors were now seasoned veterans, their hair streaked with grey, with children at home they had never seen. Many had fallen victim to disease or accidents, others had died from wounds that, in the unsanitary conditions of camp life, never properly healed. However, within the walls of Troy itself, the situation was even more oppressive. The city, once gleaming with prosperity and pride, was now overflowing with refugees from surrounding settlements, each desperately seeking shelter behind the mighty fortifications that had paradoxically become both a saving barrier and a grim prison. Food was strictly rationed, fuel was acutely scarce, and every inhabitant lived under the constant pressure of knowing that enemies were very close, tirelessly awaiting the slightest sign of weakness. King Priam had visibly aged during the years of the siege. The man, once energetic and authoritative, was now bent under the burden of grief and exhaustion, having lost so many sons that he sometimes struggled to remember which of them were still alive. Queen Hecuba glided through the palace like a shadow, her face reflecting the unbearable weight of watching her family and her city slowly perish around her. However, despite all the hardships they faced, the Trojans displayed unwavering perseverance and did not contemplate surrender. Their defensive walls remained impregnable, and their few but brave soldiers continued to fight valiantly. Their spirit, though battered by long years of siege, remained unyielding. As long as these formidable fortifications stood unbroken, Troy could withstand the assault indefinitely, and the Achaeans would never be able to claim the complete, definitive victory for which they had made so many and such heavy sacrifices. It was then that Odysseus, the wise king of Ithaca, and without doubt the most cunning of all Greek commanders, finally devised a strategy capable of ending the protracted conflict. For many months he had meticulously analyzed the situation, searching for a way for the Achaean warriors to penetrate the city without directly assaulting its impregnable fortifications. And when inspiration struck him, the solution proved surprisingly elegant and simple. Instead of trying to breach Troy by force, why not use deception to make the Trojans themselves willingly admit the Greek soldiers within their walls? Odysseus proposed creating a colossal wooden horse, hollow inside and large enough to secretly conceal a select detachment of Achaean warriors. This horse was to be presented to the Trojans as a sacred offering, a gift to the gods, intended to ensure the safe return of the Greeks home after they had supposedly ended their decade-long siege. Furthermore, the plan stipulated that the Achaeans would completely dismantle their extensive camp and sail away under the cover of night, creating the impression that they had finally conceded defeat and abandoned further struggle. The next morning the Trojans were to discover the shore completely empty, save for the mysterious wooden horse and perhaps a single Greek warrior, specially left behind to explain its purpose. The construction of this grand structure required several weeks of painstaking labor. Greek carpenters and skilled engineers worked on it in strict secrecy, carefully calculating its dimensions so that the horse would be imposing enough for a religious offering, yet contain a cleverly hidden compartment capable of holding 30 of their most elite warriors. The wooden giant was crafted to convey the impression of a true masterpiece of skill, a gift that, it was intended, the gods themselves might genuinely appreciate and graciously accept. When the horse was fully ready, Odysseus personally selected the warriors who were to hide within its belly. He chose not only skilled and fearless fighters, but also men of exceptional composure and strong nerves, capable of maintaining absolute silence and immobility for many hours. These chosen few were to spend a long time sealed inside the wooden structure, deprived of the ability to see what was happening outside, relying entirely on the success of the entire scheme for their own survival. On the appointed night, the entire Greek army struck camp and hastily embarked on their ships, which silently sailed into the utter darkness, creating the complete illusion that the Achaeans had finally given up their 10-year siege. In reality, however, they did not head home. Instead, the fleet anchored behind a nearby island, impatiently awaiting a prearranged signal that would announce the success of their cunning deception. When the first rays of dawn illuminated Troy, the absolute silence was the first thing that struck the guards on the walls. For a decade they had grown accustomed to the constant sounds of the Greek camp, the clang of weapons, the murmur of soldiers' voices, the rising column of smoke from countless campfires. Now there was nothing but the rhythmic rustle of waves caressing the empty beach. With the utmost caution, several Trojan scouts ventured beyond the city walls to reconnoiter. What they discovered seemed too incredible to be true. The Greek camp was completely deserted, only scattered debris testifying to the recent presence of people. However, on the deserted shore stood a colossal wooden horse, artfully crafted and undoubtedly intended as some sacred offering. Next to the mysterious horse, the scouts discovered a lone Greek soldier named Sinon, who, by his own account, had been abandoned by his retreating comrades. Under interrogation, Sinon recounted a meticulously rehearsed story of how the Achaeans had finally decided to end the siege and return to their homelands. Before departing, however, they wished to make an offering to ensure a safe sea voyage. The horse, Sinon explained, was dedicated to the goddess Athena, and it was deliberately made too massive to pass through the gates of Troy. The Greeks, he continued, hoped that the Trojans would attempt to bring it into the city, which would inevitably anger the goddess and unleash her wrath upon Troy. By leaving the horse outside, the Trojans would be completely safe, and the Achaeans would earn Athena's favor for their return home. This story was a truly ingenious ruse, subtly designed to prod the Trojans into the very action the Achaeans so desired. By claiming that attempting to bring the horse inside the city would incur the goddess's wrath, Sinon skillfully presented defiance of the Greeks' supposed intentions as a display of true wisdom and unyielding courage, thereby pushing them toward the fateful decision. For many hours the Trojans hotly debated the fate of the mysterious horse. Some, including the insightful priest Laocoon, firmly declared that it was obviously a cunning trick and must be immediately destroyed. "I fear the Danans, even when they bring gifts." Laocoon's famous phrase rang out as a prophetic warning, yet his wise counsel was tragically ignored when the priest and his sons were killed by giant sea snakes, which many hastened to interpret as an undeniable sign of divine displeasure at his words. Others, on the contrary, insisted that the horse undoubtedly represented a valuable religious artifact that ought to be brought into the city and consecrated in one of Troy's temples. After all, if the Achaeans had truly retreated and sailed away, what harm could there be in appropriating their abandoned offering? Ultimately, all-consuming curiosity and rekindled hope prevailed over all caution. The Trojans made the fatal decision to bring the horse into their city, although to do so they had to partially dismantle their gates and sections of their walls, the very impregnable fortifications that had protected them for 10 long and agonizing years. This arduous process took most of the daylight hours. The horse proved so colossal that entire teams of oxen were required to move it through the narrow city streets, and crowds of jubilant citizens flocked to enthusiastically gaze upon this curious trophy of their imagined victory. Children ran carefree around the massive wooden structure, and adults reached out to touch it, as if physical contact with this symbol of the Greeks' apparent defeat could somehow make their own triumph more tangible and real. On that fateful night, Troy plunged into such unbridled celebration as it had not seen for a decade. The gates, which had remained firmly closed for 10 years, were now flung wide open. Wine, once meticulously rationed, flowed freely, and people danced in the streets, reveling until exhaustion finally laid them to bed. However, inside the massive wooden horse, 30 Greek warriors remained in absolute silence, listening intently as the sounds of celebration gradually faded, replaced by deep, peaceful sleep. When they were certain the city was completely in slumber, they cautiously opened a cleverly concealed panel, allowing them to emerge. One by one, the Achaean soldiers descended from their hiding place and silently crept through the sleeping city to the main gates. There they easily neutralized a few sleepy guards and gave the prearranged signal to their comrades, who were waiting on their ships. Hidden behind a nearby island, the Achaean army, which the Trojans mistakenly believed had sailed home forever, surged back, pouring unimpeded through the open gates, which had been unbarred for them by their hidden warriors in the horse. By the time most of Troy's inhabitants realized the full horror of what was happening, their great city was already irrevocably lost. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a ruthless slaughter. The Greeks, overflowing with 10 years of frustration, accumulated pain, and grief for their fallen comrades, showed no mercy to the people who had cost them so many years of waiting and countless lives. They mercilessly destroyed not only soldiers desperately attempting to resist, but also civilians who had no part in either the beginning or the prolongation of this bloody war. King Priam fell at the altar of Zeus, where he vainly hoped to find salvation. Queen Hecuba was condemned to captivity, forced to be a silent witness to the complete collapse of everything she had ever valued and loved. Princess Cassandra, whose prophecies of Troy's imminent doom had gone unheeded, was ruthlessly dragged from the temple where she sought protection. The majestic city, which had stood as an impregnable fortress for centuries, was reduced to ashes in a single night. Walls that had seemed unshakable were torn down stone by stone. Temples were plundered, palaces turned to ruins, and the homes of ordinary citizens to heaps of ash and rubble. By dawn, Troy was no more. It was not merely defeated, but utterly erased from the face of the earth, as if it had never existed. The story of the Trojan horse serves as a cautionary reminder that sometimes our greatest triumphs are achieved not through might or valor, but through the willingness of adversaries to believe what is pleasing to them, rather than what they ought to fear. The Trojans brought destruction upon their own city with their own hands, for they ardently wished to believe that their decade-long nightmare had finally come to an end. This story also demonstrates that the means by which we achieve victory are almost as important as the victory itself. The Greeks won their war, but their triumph was tainted by deceit and betrayal, and the bitter aftertaste of such a victory echoed in their legends for many generations. Sometimes when we achieve what we desire through methods we cannot be proud of, we find that success doesn't feel at all as we had imagined. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that wars, regardless of how they begin and who prevails, always end with ordinary people paying the price for decisions made by others long ago and far away. The fall of Troy was not merely the conclusion of a military conflict, but the complete annihilation of a community, a culture, and thousands of individual lives who were utterly blameless for the choice made by Paris on that meadow of Mount Ida, yet found themselves entirely at the mercy of its tragic consequences.